Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth.
As early as the Sunday before the storm hit, there was a chance Lee County could get up to 7 feet of storm surge, and that chance meets the county's emergency plan threshold to trigger an evacuation notice. One county official telling CNN today, mandatory evacuation or not, residents had enough general information to know they should have left a full 72 hours before the storm. But, as CNN's Carlos Suarez reports, residents of Lee County are pushing back on that, saying they're used to more time to evacuate after an order is officially given.
Mixed opinions from residents themselves on how the county handled the decision.
And then when that evacuation order came, we're like 24 hours, that's not a lot.
We have so many retirees here and elderly that need more time to be able to get to places, or people that don't have vehicles that need more assistance, that having those extra days might have given people, or would have given people, more time to get affairs in order.
That wouldn't deter whether I go or not. It's all for each individual. It's right for me doesn't mean it's right for you.
But we did know days in advance that we should get out of there, because you never know when these hurricanes are going to trend. But we had some folks, elderly, 2 of whom were disabled, and one's on the 12th floor, one was on the 6th floor, and you just can't leave people like that there. And we didn't have enough capacity in our transportation to get everybody off. And so they decided to stay, and they were going to stay, and so we decided to stay with them.
Oh, how very different the white media coverage is when it's white people who the story is about. These images look very familiar, don't they? They should, because they resemble exactly what happened to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit. But the white media's treatment of this issue has been very different. The white media is breaking out the sad violins after this disaster. Now, these are white Floridians giving the same reasons for staying in Florida with a hurricane bearing down on them as the residents of New Orleans gave in 2005. Many Floridians had the ability to leave and did. Others were too old or disabled or didn't have transportation, and their caregivers didn't want to leave them. But nobody in the white media or any of the commentariat are blaming the Floridian residents for not getting out of there. No right wingnuts or left media lectures about taking personal responsibility. No blaming the victims of the storm like they did New Orleans. No blaming the people for being poor and calling them dumb or otherwise disparaging them. Instead, the white media, at most, blames the local government, the state government leaders, and that's pretty much it. And even then, they're not saying that there's any sort of systemic or historic corruption in Florida, which is one of the most politically dysfunctional states in America. But what got me was the guy saying that politics need to be put aside at a moment like this.
At this time, I think it's best to put the politics aside. We need help. The state and federal help is pouring in, and we're extremely thankful for it. We were stuck on the island for 4 days. It's apocalyptic on that island right now. It's horrifying, and everybody just needs to come together and help.
Is he serious? The governor of his state is the most politically bellicose loudmouth in American politics. On a side note, Jim Adderholt, he was chief of staff for Mike Pence when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana. That's why he said he was chief of staff in Indiana. He didn't want to say the name Mike Pence. So this guy is a Republican, that's what. Now, he claims to be nonpartisan, but he's chief of staff for Mike Pence. He's a Republican. Some in the white media are now reminding people that when DeSantis was in Congress, he voted to deny federal aid to New York after Hurricane Sandy hit that state. That was in 2012. Now, what really surprised me about that was that DeSantis had been a member of Congress. I didn't even know that he had been. And guess what? DeSantis is well aware that nobody remembers he was in Congress either. As I told you a few weeks back, Ron DeSantis is a political nobody and a complete nothing. He is eminently forgettable, and he knows it. Nobody can remember him. He has no legislation with his name on it from his time in Congress, and that's because when you spend all your time attention whoring like he does, that doesn't leave much time for actual constructive legislation. And this is why he's constantly doing whatever extremist stunt that he can. If it wasn't for his performative extremism, he might as well not even exist. Nobody would know that he did. So when this is the governor of your state, you look a little stupid saying to put politics aside. You need to direct those words at Ron DeSantis, because he's the one who most needs to hear it. A worm who makes it a point to inject politics into everything, even when he has to make it up to do it like he did with critical race theory. And now that Florida finds itself having been hit by a particularly devastating hurricane, instead of us hearing a speech about personal responsibility for the state's residents, now all we're hearing is, we're all in this together. But as the old saying goes, team reflects leadership, and the good old boys in Florida have clearly been following Ron DeSantis' lead, such as it is. I guess that's the reason why a number of them waited until just the day before the hurricane made landfall before actually ordering an evacuation. They waited until literally the last minute. Now, these are the same racists who ridiculed New Orleans after Katrina, and they've been predictably silent now, though. Now, when you got Florida officials who are not even following their own county guidelines about what to do in the event of a hurricane, well, isn't that grounds for them to be removed? DeSantis made headlines for suspending a Florida prosecutor who said that he wouldn't enforce DeSantis' abortion ban. But of course, DeSantis has a pristine record of ignoring the incompetence and even criminality of his fellow Republicans. Nothing they do ever rises to the level of him using his gubernatorial powers to remove them from office. But this is about more than a couple of local yokels who decided that they wanted to prove how tough they were. DeSantis himself refused to do anything about Florida's insurance crisis. A number of Florida's insurance companies have been going out of business or leaving the state or otherwise just refusing to fulfill the terms of their own policies. And this has been a problem for a while in that state, and it's gotten worse under Ron DeSantis' leadership. This is where performative extremism runs headlong into reality. DeSantis' anti-black antics may have delighted his racist base, but that temporary sugar rush that they got from his performative extremism isn't so sweet now. They could care less about critical race theory because they're up against a real problem, not a fake one that they made up just to see if they could get some political mileage out of it. But DeSantis' base aren't the only ones who have had a case of convenient memory loss. The white media has also forgotten all about that too. Nobody in the white media is bothering to add up how many hours and how much money DeSantis wasted on his pathetic political stunts that he would pull. He had been wasting hundreds if not thousands of hours. DeSantis spent far more time obsessing about a non-existent critical race theory epidemic than he did worrying about the real and biggest threat that his state faces every year: hurricanes. He spent more time getting so-called laws passed, which were nothing more than legislative trolling, all of which getting knocked down by the courts. He spent more time on that to get some attention for himself than he did protecting his own state. Now, of course, the right-wing racists will try to claim that, well, even if DeSantis did devote all of those hours that he wasted being a culture warrior to actually fighting for insurance companies to remain in Florida and keeping them in business, well, there's no guarantee that that would have made a difference. There's no guarantee that he would have gotten any substantive legislation or regulations passed. Well, first of all, he would have. His predecessors certainly focused on that, and they didn't have all the problems with insurance that DeSantis is having. And secondly, we'll never know if DeSantis focusing on his job would have made a difference because he's never done it. He played the game of winning the news cycle. That's what Christopher Rufo and the rest of those right-wing nuts from those think tanks taught him to do. Try to win the news cycle. He doesn't have a political strategy. All he has are a bunch of half-baked tactics. Last week it was pass a law to arrest protesters. Today it was critical race theory. Then his immigrant busing stunt. He's just doing whatever over-the-top asinine idiocy he can to get himself on Fox News. Well, now he's up against a real problem, and the state is suffering because of his refusal and his inability to lead. Florida gets hit with hurricanes 1 or 2 every single year, almost without fail. You can practically set your watch to it. This wasn't some out-of-the-blue incident. This is something that happens practically every single year. That's why insurance is such a huge issue in Florida. Because when you live in the single most disaster-prone part of the country, you can't afford to have gaps in your coverage. But that's exactly what Florida's had, because the chump-in-chief has been wasting all of his time trying to be a culture warrior, fighting the war against black people. But don't expect this to cost him too much in terms of political capital. The rank-and-file white supremacists in America hate black people more than they love their own lives. The white media ought to be hammering DeSantis on his racial hysteria and how stupid and deadly his preoccupation with anti-black legislation has been, but they're not. They should be pointing out that this is precisely why Florida's in the situation that it's in. The hurricane was a natural disaster. But the failure of having any sort of insurance coverage and the inability to respond to it, that's totally man-made. And the man in this case, if he can be called that, is Ron DeSantis. But the white media is not going to be linking his legislative failure to be ready for a hurricane to all of this anti-black trolling his legislation that he's been doing, because the white media agrees with him. They don't want to discredit his anti-black racism, so they're not going to be linking these two things in the minds of viewers, even though that's exactly what people who have a brain have been thinking. Every time you mention Ron DeSantis' name, it's all about his performative extremism. Gee, guess that's why his state wasn't ready for a hurricane. But the white media is looking going, well, we don't want to put too much emphasis on that, and we definitely don't want to bring up critical race theory or anything about race. We want to make it seem as if that's separate. That has nothing to do with this. Sure, he's a lousy politician, but that has nothing to do with his anti-black racism. Though on a side note, it has been entertaining to watch as dumb DeSantis has been doing interviews with the media trying to explain away his failures. He's like a deer in headlights with these interviews. He and Christopher Rufo only know how to spout their standard stock anti-black racist talking points. Now that's fine if they're the ones who are setting the agenda and they're the ones who are getting in front of the camera saying, here's the latest bit of performative extremism that I want to pull. But in this case, it doesn't work. DeSantis simply doesn't know what to say when the issue is a hurricane. He cannot find a way to shoehorn critical race theory into the discussion because it would be stupid. It has no place there. It's irrelevant. And robbed of his favorite deflection and talking point, he just sputters and stammers like a rundown jalopy. At a time like this, the same idiots that were cheering on all of his asinine racist antics, they really need a leader now, but they don't have one, and it's their own damn fault because it didn't bother them before. DeSantis needs to show the people of Florida that he can give real answers, but he can't. Because instead of doing his job and focusing on being governor of Florida, he was wasting his time preparing to be president. Well, if this incident is any indication, Florida wasn't the only casualty of Hurricane Ian. DeSantis' overblown ego has also been blown away. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Jean Floreval, Burkett Cochrane, Brian Ellis, Keith, and E. Horton. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.